Venezuela, from one of the richest countries in the world. In the middle of the 20th century, Venezuela was considered one of the richest countries in the world. During the 1950s, its economy was growing rapidly, and the country enjoyed a level of prosperity that many other nations could not match. At that time, Venezuela's income per person was higher than in several European countries. Modern highways were being built, new buildings were rising in major cities, and the country appeared to be moving confidently toward a wealthy future. The capital city, Caracas, became a symbol of this prosperity. It developed quickly and attracted businesses, workers, and investors from different parts of the world. Construction projects expanded across the city, and new infrastructure transformed the urban landscape. For many observers, Caracas represented the success of a country that had discovered an extremely valuable resource. The main source of this wealth was oil. Venezuela sits on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet. As the global demand for energy increased during the 20th century, oil production became the foundation of the Venezuelan economy. Large oil fields produced enormous quantities of crude oil, and exports generated massive revenues for the country. Oil quickly became the dominant industry in Venezuela. Over time, it provided more than 90% of the country's export earnings. A large portion of government income also came directly from oil production. These revenues allowed the government to finance infrastructure projects, increase public spending, and maintain a relatively high standard of living for many citizens. However, this enormous wealth also created an important weakness in the structure of the economy. Because oil generated such large profits, other sectors of the economy developed more slowly. Industries such as manufacturing and agriculture received less attention and investment compared to the oil sector. As a result, Venezuela began to rely heavily on imports. The country started purchasing large amounts of food, machinery, consumer goods, and medicine from abroad instead of producing them domestically. Oil revenues made it easy to pay for these imports, so the economy continued to operate without major problems for many years. This situation gradually created a deep dependence on a single natural resource. The stability of the entire economy depended largely on the continued success of the oil industry. When oil revenues were strong, the country could afford imports and maintain government spending without difficulty. Economists often describe this kind of situation as a resource-dependent economy. When one resource dominates national income, other industries can become weaker over time. The economy may appear strong during periods of high prices for that resource, but it becomes vulnerable to sudden changes in global markets. For many years, Venezuela's oil wealth masked this vulnerability. The steady flow of oil money allowed the country to maintain growth and support government programs. As long as oil exports continued to generate large revenues, the economic system appeared stable and prosperous. The rise of Hugo Chavez and the socialist model. By the 1990s, Venezuela was no longer experiencing the same level of prosperity that had defined earlier decades. Although the country still possessed enormous oil resources, economic growth had slowed and many Venezuelans were becoming increasingly frustrated with the political system. Poverty was rising, inequality remained high, and a large part of the population believed that the country's oil wealth was benefiting only a small group of people. For decades, Venezuela had been governed by traditional political parties that many citizens viewed as corrupt and ineffective. Economic problems and declining living standards created growing dissatisfaction across the country. As frustration spread, people began looking for new leadership that promised significant change. In this environment, Hugo Chavez emerged as a powerful political figure. Chavez was a former military officer who gained national attention after attempting a failed coup against the government in 1992. Although the coup did not succeed, the event made him widely known among the public. Many Venezuelans saw him as someone willing to challenge the existing political system. In 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. His campaign focused heavily on promises to transform the country's political and economic structure. Chavez argued that Venezuela's oil wealth should be used to improve the lives of ordinary citizens and reduce the large gap between the rich and the poor. After taking office, Chavez began introducing major changes to the country's economic policies. His government promoted a system in which the state played a much larger role in managing the economy. The government gradually expanded its control over key industries and increased its influence over economic activity. One of the most important policies was the nationalization of major sectors. The government began taking control of industries such as oil production, banking, agriculture, and several large companies. Many private businesses were placed under state ownership, and the role of the government in economic decision-making grew significantly. At the same time, Chavez introduced a wide range of social programs designed to support lower-income citizens. These programs included expanded access to healthcare, subsidized food programs, public housing initiatives, and other forms of government assistance. The goal was to use national resources to reduce poverty and provide greater social support for millions of people. These programs became very popular among large parts of the population. Many citizens felt that they were finally receiving a share of the country's oil wealth. Government spending increased rapidly, and social programs became a central feature of the country's political and economic system. However, these policies were heavily dependent on Venezuela's oil revenues. The government used income from oil exports to finance its expanding social programs and public spending. As long as oil prices remained high, the system appeared stable and sustainable. Instead of reducing the country's dependence on oil, the economic structure became even more tied to oil income. Government programs, public spending, and large parts of the economy relied directly on the continued flow of oil revenues. The oil boom and the illusion of prosperity. In the early 2000s, global oil prices began to rise dramatically. As demand for energy increased around the world, the price of a barrel of oil climbed to extremely high levels. At times it approached and even exceeded $100 per barrel. For Venezuela, whose economy was heavily dependent on oil exports, this surge in prices created an enormous flow of revenue. The country suddenly began receiving massive income from oil sales. The government had access to billions of dollars in export earnings, and the national budget expanded rapidly. With such a large amount of money entering the economy, Venezuela appeared to be experiencing a new period of prosperity. Government spending increased significantly during these years. Large amounts of money were directed towards social programs, infrastructure projects, and subsidies for basic goods. Programs providing healthcare, housing, and food assistance expanded, and many citizens began to see improvements in their daily lives. Because the government controlled a large portion of the oil income, public spending became one of the main drivers of economic activity. Oil revenues allowed the state to support social programs while also financing imports that supplied the country with goods from abroad. During this period, Venezuela imported large quantities of food, consumer products, machinery, and medicine. Oil money made it possible to purchase these goods from international markets instead of producing them domestically. Stores remained stocked with imported products, and daily life for many people appeared stable. At the same time, the government continued expanding its influence over the economy. The state increased its role in directing economic activity, and more industries operated under government control. Regulations and nationalizations made the business environment increasingly uncertain for private companies. As a result, private investment began to decline. Some investors reduced their activity in the country, while others moved their capital elsewhere. With fewer new investments and increasing government control, the private sector gradually became weaker. Instead of using the oil boom to diversify the economy, Venezuela became even more dependent on oil. Manufacturing and agriculture remained underdeveloped, and the country continued relying on imports for many essential goods. Another important issue was the condition of the oil industry itself. Oil production required constant investment in infrastructure, equipment, and technical expertise. Maintaining high levels of production depended on experienced workers and modern facilities. However, during the years of high oil prices, most attention was focused on spending oil revenues rather than strengthening the long-term capacity of the oil sector. While large amounts of money flowed into government programs and imports, the underlying structure of the economy remained heavily dependent on oil income. As long as global oil prices remained high, this system continued to function. The steady flow of oil revenue supported government spending and allowed the economy to maintain the appearance of stability and prosperity. The collapse, oil price crash, and hyperinflation. In 2014, a major shift occurred in global energy markets. The price of oil, which had remained high for many years, began to fall sharply. Within a relatively short period of time, the price of a barrel of oil dropped dramatically. For many oil-exporting countries, this created economic pressure, but for Venezuela the impact was especially severe. Because the Venezuelan economy depended so heavily on oil exports, the decline in oil prices immediately reduced the country's main source of income. Government revenues fell rapidly as the money coming from oil exports decreased. The economic system that had relied on high oil prices suddenly faced a serious financial problem. At the same time, government spending remained extremely high. For years, the state had financed large social programs, subsidies, and other public expenses using oil income. When oil revenues dropped, the government still needed large amounts of money to maintain these programs and cover the national budget. Without sufficient income from oil exports, the government began facing a growing budget deficit. The gap between government spending and government revenue became larger and larger. To manage this deficit, the authorities began creating additional money within the national financial system. Increasing the money supply without a corresponding increase in goods and services quickly created inflation. Prices started rising across the economy as the value of the national currency declined. As inflation accelerated, everyday goods became more expensive and the purchasing power of the population began to fall. Over time, inflation turned into hyperinflation. Prices began rising at extremely rapid rates, making it difficult for people to plan their spending or save money. The value of the national currency declined so quickly that it became increasingly difficult for citizens to buy basic goods. The economic situation also affected the supply of products inside the country. Because Venezuela relied heavily on imports for food, medicine, and many consumer goods, the decline in oil revenues made it difficult to pay for those imports. As a result, shortages began to appear in many parts of the economy. Stores struggled to maintain consistent supplies of basic products, and the availability of goods became increasingly unstable. The decline in imports combined with rising prices created a difficult economic environment for many Venezuelan households. During this period, the overall economy contracted dramatically. Economic activity declined, businesses struggled to operate under conditions of high inflation, and government finances remained under severe pressure. The country experienced one of the most significant economic downturns in modern history, with national output shrinking substantially over the following years. The combination of falling oil revenues, high government spending, and hyperinflation transformed what had once been one of the richest economies in Latin America into a country facing a prolonged economic crisis.